pigeon sees you cross the same square each day. One morning, it stays calm as you approach, but retreats from someone else. Coincidence, clothing, or real recognition? Welcome to the Pigeon Mind. Subscribe for calm evidence-led documentaries. Today we follow experiments behind this question because scientific answer is more careful, more surprising than a simple yes or no. It is one of those quiet questions that sounds almost silly at first until you really sit with it. Can an ordinary city pigeon, the kind you see everywhere, actually recognize one specific human being? Not simply notice that a person is there, but truly tell one individual apart from another. It is very easy to assume an answer here, but assuming something is not the same as knowing it. Plenty of people are convinced that their own local pigeons clearly know exactly who they are. But belief and gut feeling are not evidence, and careful science demands far more than that. So a handful of researchers decided to actually test the idea under careful and controlled conditions. And what they ended up finding is genuinely far more interesting than a simple yes or no. The real evidence on this question comes from a small set of clever and revealing experiments. Each of those experiments tested a slightly different piece of this surprisingly deep little question. So let us look closely and honestly at what the researchers actually discovered about pigeons. The findings are careful, honest, and a great deal more nuanced than most people would expect. The most famous experiment of them all took place in an ordinary city park in Paris. The birds being studied there were completely ordinary feral pigeons, the same kind seen everywhere. This detail genuinely mattered because these were wild city birds, not tame laboratory animals. The researchers specifically wanted to test recognition in genuinely realistic, everyday world conditions. So two different people took part, and they were carefully chosen to look broadly similar. Each of the two people wore a laboratory coat, but in a clearly and obviously different color. Both of them offered exactly the same kind of food to the very same group of birds, but the two of them behaved in two completely and very deliberately opposite ways. One person stayed gentle and entirely neutral, simply standing calmly among the resting birds. The other person repeatedly chased the pigeons away, again and again, over many separate sessions. This was repeated patiently, day after day, so the birds had plenty of time to learn. The researchers then watched closely to see whether the pigeons would treat the two differently. And the pigeons clearly did, steadily learning to avoid the person who had chased them. They stayed close to the gentle feeder while keeping a wary distance from the hostile one. So far, this might simply mean that the birds had just remembered the colored coats. And that is exactly where the clever twist that the researchers planned comes into the story. To rule out the coats entirely, the researchers cleverly changed the rules of the whole test. First, both people stopped chasing completely, and now both behaved in a perfectly neutral way. This removed any fresh new behavior that the birds could possibly react to in the moment. Then came the truly crucial step where the colored coats were quietly swapped between them. The former chaser now wore the calm person's coat, and the calm person wore the chaser's. If the pigeons had been tracking the coats, then their avoidance should now follow the clothing. But if they track the actual person, the avoidance should stay with the original chaser. This single simple swap, neatly and cleanly separated the two competing possible explanations. So the real question becomes, what actually happened once those coats had finally changed hands? The pigeons firmly kept avoiding the original chaser, even when he wore the brand new coat. The clothing had clearly moved, but the wariness stayed firmly attached to the actual person. This was the key result, the finding that made the whole experiment so genuinely revealing. The color of the coat alone simply could not explain the bird's careful and consistent choices. The pigeons had clearly been using more stable features to tell the two similar people apart. So what exactly did this clever little experiment genuinely manage to prove about pigeons? It showed that ordinary feral pigeons can genuinely learn to tell two similar people apart. It showed they rely on stable visual cues and not just on easily changed clothing. And it showed all of this happened in genuinely wild birds under real-world conditions. That is a genuinely important and very carefully demonstrated finding about pigeon recognition. But truly good science is just as careful and honest about what it does not show. The experiment did not manage to isolate the human face as a single separate cue. The face was never cleanly separated from posture, from movement, and from many other features. So we genuinely cannot say that the pigeons were reading faces and nothing else at all. It also showed no affection, no loyalty, and no real proof of any kind of lasting memory. What it very clearly did show was learning, and that learning alone is genuinely remarkable. The birds had learned a useful pattern, knowing who was safe and who was a real threat. And in a busy real city, that one simple skill genuinely helps a small bird survive. So the Paris study answered an important part of the question, but certainly not all of it. If the clothing was not the cue, then could the human face itself carry the real signal? Other researchers decided to tackle this exact question with a very different kind of experiment. It really helps a great deal to keep these separate studies clearly apart in your mind. This time, the birds being tested were homing pigeons rather than free-living feral ones. That particular difference matters quite a lot, and we will return to why it is important. The researchers showed these pigeons a series of photographs of different individual human faces. Some of those photographs were of familiar human caretakers, and some were of total strangers. The birds were carefully trained to respond differently to the familiar and unfamiliar faces. And quite remarkably, some of the pigeons did genuinely learn to tell the faces apart. Certain individual birds could reliably distinguish a familiar human face from an unfamiliar one. That is a genuinely striking result, but the honest limits of the study truly do matter. The number of birds tested was actually quite small, and their performance varied quite widely. Some of the birds did very well, while others clearly struggled to tell the faces apart. And once again, remember these were homing pigeons, kept and trained in controlled settings. So we genuinely must be cautious about stretching this finding to every wild street pigeon. Still, it clearly shows that the raw ability to learn human faces genuinely does exist. A third important study added one more genuinely fascinating piece to this whole puzzle. This time around, laboratory pigeons were carefully tested with real, living, present human individuals. Not flat photographs this time, but actual people standing right there in front of them. The pigeons in this study clearly learned to tell those real individuals reliably apart. And quite interestingly, the cues coming from the head appeared to be especially important. The overall shape and features of the head seemed to carry much of the recognition signal. But then came a genuinely surprising and very telling twist to the whole experiment. When those very same birds were later shown photographs, their recognition simply did not transfer. The pigeons that clearly knew the real people then struggled badly with their flat photographs. This strongly suggests that a flat static image loses something genuinely and deeply important. A photograph drops the motion, the depth, and the living context of an actual real person. A real and moving human being offers far more usable information than any single still picture. So a pigeon might genuinely know you in the flesh and yet completely fail with your photo. That very gap itself is actually a real and useful clue about how pigeon recognition works. So now we can finally gather all three of these studies into one honest overall picture. First, wild feral pigeons can clearly tell similar people apart using stable visual cues. Second, some homing pigeons can even learn to recognize familiar human faces from photographs. Third, lab pigeons recognize real people with cues from the head seeming especially important. But that recognition of real people often does not transfer neatly to flat photographs. Taken together, all these findings show a real ability, but one that is carefully bounded. Pigeons genuinely can learn and then reliably recognize the individual human beings around them. But exactly which cues they lean on most still remains genuinely and honestly uncertain. The face, the head, the body, and the movement all probably play at least some role. And researchers have not yet measured the precise weight of each separate individual cue. We also genuinely should not assume that every single pigeon recognizes every single person. Recognition almost certainly varies from one bird to the next and from place to place, and we still have very little proof of just how long that memory truly lasts. So the honest answer here is a confident yes, carefully wrapped in real and important limits. So what does all of this research actually mean for you and your own local pigeons? It means that recognition is genuinely possible, but it is never automatic or ever guaranteed. A pigeon that reacts to you may genuinely know you from many repeated past encounters, but it might also simply be responding to food, to the place, or to plain habit. So observe carefully and patiently before deciding that a bird truly recognizes you specifically. Look closely for individual markings so that you can reliably track the very same bird. Watch whether it genuinely treats you differently from how it treats other passing people. Always check whether food is visible, since food clearly changes almost everything a bird does. Notice whether it reacts to you in the same way across many separate days. These simple little observations quietly echo what the researchers so carefully controlled for. In a small but real way, you become your own patient and careful little researcher. And whatever you happen to find, you will start to see your local pigeons far more clearly, not as one faceless gray crowd, but as real individuals genuinely capable of learning you. That quiet shift in seeing is really the true reward of asking the question honestly. So can a city pigeon really recognize you? The honest answer is a careful and qualified yes. The research clearly shows that pigeons can learn and tell individual humans reliably apart. They rely on stable visual cues, with the head seeming to matter a very great deal. But that recognition is bounded, uneven, and clearly shaped by each bird and each setting. It is not affection, it is not loyalty, and it is certainly not reading your mind. It is simply a living animal learning the patterns that help it to safely survive. And that careful and honest truth is far more satisfying than any easy comforting myth. The science offers us real wonder, grounded firmly in genuine and careful evidence. So I will gently leave you now with one simple thing to go and test for yourself. Pick one clearly marked pigeon that you see often and observe it across many separate days. Watch whether it treats you noticeably differently from the unfamiliar strangers around you. Try to rule out the food, the place, and the habit as best as you possibly can. Tell me exactly where it happened and precisely what that particular bird actually did. And then tell me whether you truly believe that the recognition was genuinely real. Because the honest question, asked slowly and patiently, is exactly where real wonder begins. And that ordinary gray bird may genuinely know you far better than you would ever have guessed.